No, I couldn't get it. And then I was like, well, it's not too hot, so whatever. And I got it in the car. Got it out somehow. Impressive. You just need to just start. Shoot straight up my tongue. Yeah, but the games are early. Like this seems for some reason. I assume probably, I don't know. And so did the game 6:30, 6:40. So it's home by 10, which is nice. Yeah, it's so little. Yeah, yeah. And they've been approving my push pipeline instead of showing close weight, so I think they're and
Was this MacBook here when I came in?
No, it was not on the
Oh, okay. I didn't notice it. I'm like, that looks oldish. I don't know. I feel bad. I don't know. Oh, the name is there. I can find who this is. Awesome. I feel bad that someone forgot their laptop. I don't want to just leave it here because things have a tendency to disappear. Okay. Not my. I will solve this problem. Okay. Alrighty. I think everyone's back. I think. All right. Let's jump back in here. Okay, so we got one more topic to get through for the midterm. We should have lots of time. I did have this question up. If anyone wants to write anything, that'd be greatly appreciated. It's kind of interesting. Obviously, I think that documentary afterwards kind of makes you want to take a shower a little bit, seeing all of those people saying such horrible things. Yes. Nice. This is all very good. So there's definitely, thank you for all of those. Those are really, really interesting. Social contract of hooking up, brief, emotionless, alcohol, etc. Very good. Okay. So I will say there will definitely be a question on the midterm that sort of relates. It's not just about the documentary. It's not going to be like summarize the documentary. It'll be, connect it, something like this, connect it to an idea, discussed in the lectures. And if someone wasn't here, I know sometimes people don't come to class. I'll send out the name of the documentary so people can watch it on their own time. Oh, if they want. Relating to this, people's ability to form relationships. Women being socialized and valid through sex. Yeah. Very nice. Social contract of hooking up. Cheapness of sex. Drinking is essential for sex, especially in hookup culture. Well, then, normative amongst young people. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting documentary. I think it's really very distressing. The way, especially women are sexualized, and the way people talk about sex. I just thought in that documentary, I've watched it maybe 5 or 6 times, and it always absolutely freaks me out. All right, so those are all very good. Keep those ideas in mind, especially some of them about hookup culture, drinking, and all that. So it'll be useful for you on the exam, I think. All right, so all right, so the midterm. I'll say a couple words about the midterm, and then I'll try and work through youth and religion pretty quickly. I think there's some interesting things to say. Obviously, or I wouldn't put it in here. The midterm was pretty good, right? I actually, as I was going through and marking it, I thought the marks, the average was going to be higher because there's lots of people getting 10s out of 10s on questions. I was like, oh no, I made this test too easy. So I was pretty satisfied with it. In terms of I've probably taught this class 15 times. You're right on average, around 80, 81% is right on average for what I expect midterms to be. Don't stop studying for the second one, because sometimes people are like, oh, I did great on that first midterm, and then they stop studying for the second one, and then it doesn't go as well. So don't make that mistake. But I was pretty happy with it. If you want to review it, obviously we have a couple of days. We can do it tomorrow. We can do it Friday, Monday, even before we write the exam. So Monday is the next midterm, I believe, June 3rd. Is that right? Yes. So is the next midterm, and that'll be the same format as the last one, right? So in the first half of the class, that first 90 minutes from 1 till 2:30, I will be hanging out in this room with 5 people. You can write it anytime during the day, though, and all of that stuff. So no worries there. And yeah, if you want to review it before then, so tomorrow, Friday, or Monday, before class starts. So before 1 o'clock, I can definitely do that. Probably the easiest is going to be Google Meets or Zoom. I don't know if you can hear, I have a bit of a cold. So if it was regular semester and we were doing 1 hour classes, I definitely would have canceled class today. But sadly, I can't cancel a 3 hour class and still feel okay about myself. So probably Google Meets, because I'm guessing my cold will take its revenge tomorrow. But I'm happy to go over the questions with you and just kind of point out, where maybe you lost marks and things that you could do better. Okay, how does everyone feel about that? Okay? All right, and you can come talk to me briefly after class, but I hate it when that happens. I have to fetch my 14-year-old from the 4th floor and head off to pick up my 4-year-old. So that should be fun. Alrighty. Okay, so youth and religion. This is actually, for me, I mean, if you've ever taken a class with me before, you'll know that I am a sociology of religion super nerd. I love sociology of religion. It's probably my favorite topic. And my class, I love teaching. I teach it in the fall, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m. It's a really, really fun class, and you get to find out all sorts of things about me in particular, like what theorists I really like, because I spend a lot of time just praising a bunch of theorists over and over again, and then just kind of making a thing out of it. So, and sorry, you'll have seen a lot of this material. I'm really sorry. If you want to leave, that I wouldn't be offended, because he took sociology of religion with me in the fall. So I want to talk a little bit about youth and religion, and this is actually, I think, one of those interesting topics. There's a ton of research on it, especially coming out of the US, but it's something that when I've reviewed, and I've probably reviewed like 10 different sociology of youth textbooks in the time I've been teaching this class, it's a topic that no one ever puts in, because I think there is a sort of underlying assumption that young people don't care about religion, especially as we talk about millennials and Gen Z. Religion, spirituality, any of that stuff, young people don't really care about. I don't think that's true, but okay. Okay, I think I've already answered these questions. Will you be tested on the documentary in the midterm? There will definitely be one question alone. They'll ask you to connect it to something else we talked about in the class. And will you be able to review your midterms? Yes, just fire me off an email and we will make a time, I promise. Between me booking flights for people coming to Edmonton in June and trying to sort out our budget, yelling at a senior scholar from Toronto who will not send me the form I need, I will get you in, I promise. Okay, so one of the things that's happening when we talk about religion, and I think why sometimes this gets ignored as a topic when it comes to young people, is because really for the last almost 30 years now, what we've seen is a kind of general trend of increasing disaffiliation from religion amongst all kind of generations. Okay, so this graph, this is percentage of religious nuns by generation in Canada, taken from the General Social Surveys of StatsCan up to 2020. So it doesn't include the most recent one, which is 2022, but it gives you a kind of general idea. So what we see is kind of generally growing disaffiliation, or people leaving religion, right? People moving away from religion and to a bunch of different identities. Now this could be, it could be atheist, could be agnostic, or it could be what's often referred to as none, right? Nothing in particular. Now, in Canada, unfortunately, and one of my gripes with the General Social Survey and the way that the question is asked in the Canadian census is I don't think it's asked in a particularly sophisticated way. They tend to ask about religious identity, and they just have no religion, right? So they have like Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, and a bunch of other ones. I'm just going to leave it there. And a bunch of other ones, and then they have no religion. But they don't distinguish in no religion between different forms of non-religious identity. So they kind of lump all of these things together under one kind of aegis. And I think it's a bad way of asking it. We've talked about this in the Center for Criminological Research. I'm like, yeah, we really need to figure out how to fix this. Some people will write in that they're atheist or agnostic, but we really don't know what's under this number and what identities people are actually adopting in Canada as much as we do, say, in the US, because they have different social science surveys that ask this question. Though weirdly, the census, like the US Census, the one that comes out from the Census Bureau, isn't allowed to ask questions about religion because of the enshrined separation of church and state in the US Constitution. They actually don't ask questions about religious identity on the census. So it's left to other social science surveys to look at it. But, all right, when we look at, disaffiliation, basically it's a story of upward growth for every generational cohort, right? Gen Z isn't on here, but if it was, we would see that Gen Z, probably starts around here, and they'd be pretty close to where millennials are, right? There's not a ton of difference between millennials and Gen Z from the data I've seen. But basically, each generation is less and less religious, right? And a larger and larger proportion are taking no religion as their option when it comes to what they think of as their religious identity. So this has been one of the big stories, right? If we talk about, this is true in the US as well. If we talk about the changes in religion that have happened in the last 30 years, the growth of the nuns, right, is probably one of the most significant social science trends that we've seen. It's set to change things in really kind of interesting ways. Now that said, I was just reading a piece by Ryan Burge, who I think I talked about last time. I can't remember now. He's one of my, I talked about him. He was the guy who was those graphs about people not having sex. Ryan's one of my favorite social scientists, and he's been running data from the comparative election study in the US, and he's concluded that the growth of the nuns has kind of plateaued in the US at least. So it's probably the biggest change, in kind of religious identity or identities we've ever seen is from about 1990 till about 2025 or 2024, the shift to a lot of people identifying as nothing in particular, and that may be slowing down. But if you look here, right, it's almost, in Canada, it's almost about half of millennials, and it'll be about half of Gen Z who now consider themselves to have no religion. And as, the silence disappear, the baby boomers start to die off, the proportion of people as part of the total population that are nothing in particular, that have no religion, is going to grow just by the fact that the religious people tend to be a little older and they are, dying off. Okay, so this is kind of what, this is from a few years ago, from Ryan Burge. Again, wow, my voice is really croaky. Oh dear. So, this is what kind of the no religion and the growth of no religion looks like. Generally in the US, this is not by generational cohort, but I just thought I'd show you kind of what it looks like. And so you see, right, if we went back to 1980, no religion was about 5%. And here, this is 2020 where the data ended because, or 2018 where the data ended, roughly, because that's that wave that he was using when he made this graph. And we see that no religion has kind of peaked up around 25%, right? So, no religion grew really quickly. Now, it tended to grow in the same proportion as the decline of this one, mainline Protestantism. But we see, and just to show you how big of a kind of social science change this is, from 5% in 1980 to about 25% by 2018, 2020. This is a massive, massive change from a social scientific perspective. And everything after this dotted line is a projection. So Ryan was like, all right, if we just kind of hold the trend lines consistent, basically by 2030, you'd have about 30%, a little less than 30% of Americans being nuns, which would make it, the largest single religious group because Catholics and evangelicals, both tracking downwards. So big, big change. And this is principally driven by millennials right? This is our millennials and Gen Z, both of whom are less religious than previous cohorts. Okay. So again, this data is a couple of years old now, but you can kind of see what this looks like by generational cohort in the US. So the greatest generation, they never got into double digits in terms of being nuns, and then they stopped being measured after that point because there's not enough of them left. And this is all data from the GSS, which actually asks good religion questions. The silence, right, kind of still around, and they've kind of reached about 10% of them saying they have no religious identity. Boomers, you're getting up to 15-ish%. Gen X, started really low and then kind of through emerging adulthood swooped up, and they've settled at around 20%. And millennials started the highest. Well, I guess there's a weird outlier number for Gen X for some reason. Really early in the sample, in like the late 1980s or early 1980s, they were really high, but all the other data has been low. Millennials, right, started about here, somewhere around 25%, and then by the time we reach the end of the sample in the US, they're about here. Now this is slightly old data, right? Gen Z only had one data point because there weren't enough of them in the sample before that, and it was a little bit lower than millennials, and I can just tell you that basically from there, Gen Z kind of went up here, and is then kind of flatlined, right? Not quite that dramatically, but that's basically what it's looked like. They've hit about the same point as millennials, right? About 40-ish% of Gen Z in the US say they have no religion, and it's sort of gotten stuck there. And the most recent data that Ryan just published last week from the comparative election study then had them actually dropping just a little bit, right? It actually dropped, it kind of peaked out about 45%, and then in the most recent wave dropped down to 42. Now that doesn't mean it's going to keep going down. It just means probably, it's going to do kind of like this, up, down, and up, and down, and up, and down, right? So, what do I have next here? Okay. So, that's the nuns. All right. One of the things that's, sorry, just catching my breath. It's been a weird day. I take a little drink of water. I have taken too much Dayquil and not eaten enough food because I had to run and get my daughter at school. Okay, so deep breath. Okay, I want to go back here for just 2 seconds. So this is, I guess, kind of one of the interesting things is that this growth of the nuns has caused a lot of, I don't know if I want to say panic, a lot of interest in kind of political science, in sociology, in terms of what this shift kind of means for people in general and for society, right? As people move away from religion, what does that mean? And the fact that it looks like it's kind of plateaued is kind of interesting as well, right? So what's probably happened, and I'll just explain this, and if you want to hear more, come take sociology of religion with me, but I'll explain it really quickly. Sort of I think the best explanation that we have for what's happened is that in the past, right, if we go back here, to even beyond this, further in the past, you had a lot of very marginally religious people. As time has gone forward and, social trends have changed, a bunch of things have happened, urbanization, more pluralism. Some of the people that were marginally connected to religion have sort of peeled off, right? It's actually a phenomenon in sociology of religion that we call marginal peel off. When people just leave religion, it's because they were kind of marginal and they've been peeled off. It's really rare that people with a deeply rooted religious identity ultimately become non-religious, right? Most of the peel off comes from those people who are marginal. Now, what you're going to get, and what kind of seems like it's going to happen going forward here, is sort of a mutual marginal peel off between nuns and religious people. So basically, going forward, marginally religious people, and there's still going to be some, right, kids raised in religious households who aren't that interested in it, they might be peeled off and become nothing in particular. but it also looks like we're now sort of peeling off marginal nuns and they're becoming religious. So we have this kind of back and forth going on. Okay, so I guess I should write that down maybe. Marginal peel off is a real phenomenon. But what looks like it's kind of happened, with the plateauing of non-religion, is that most of the marginal people have already now been peeled off, and the people who remain religious are not going anywhere because those identities are pretty well ensconced. Okay, so another kind of generational chart here for you, and just to show you the degree to which things have kind of changed. And this has caused a lot of panic, right? This has caused a lot of panic amongst religious people. So this comes from Pew Research, the Pew Research study, and these numbers were published in 2019. So things have likely shifted a bit since then. But if you look, right, if you go back to the silence, 84% of the population was, this is in 2019. This isn't like super far in the past. 84% of silence said they were Christian, right, with only 10 unaffiliated and 4 non-Christian faiths. The boomers, right, 76% still said they were Christian. Generation X, 67%. And it's only when you get to millennials, right, and they've got slightly different ranges than we've been talking about, but that's okay. My sister would be happy because she would be excluded from this, but that's all right. 49% saying they're Christian, 9% saying they're another religion, and a pretty substantial 40% claiming non-religious identity. So, the headline that came with this from Pew was, Christianity continues its rapid decline in America. I always thought that was a little bit overstated, but it's been a kind of an earthquake in a lot of ways in the American body politic, that religion is fading, and especially Christianity has faded really hard, and especially, like big declines generation to generation. And I think, I haven't seen updated Pew numbers. They haven't published them in a while, but based on kind of what I saw out of the comparative election study, it looks like the Gen Z numbers are substantively pretty similar to the millennial ones, right? The decline has kind of slowed with Gen Z. Okay. I guess what's on the bottom of this, just monthly attendance. And you can see, again, if you look at the silent generation, 61%, attend at least once a month some kind of religious service. And every generation from there on kind of goes down. The boomers, it's only 49. Gen X is 46. And, it's a pretty paltry 35% for millennials. Now, there's also, this number that I think should count a little bit, which is, a few times a year. There's still substantial numbers of people who are attending somewhat infrequently, right? Who are still, probably not completely checked out of religion, but, the seldom to never categories grow with every generation. So as we go forward, right, fewer people have described themselves as religious, and people are attending religious services a lot less. And yeah, it's about 2/3 of millennials say they go to church or a religious service a few times a year or less. Okay. So, here, I'll label this for you. What do young people actually believe? Now, I know millennials are not exactly young anymore, but we have a lot of really interesting information on millennials. I haven't seen it. Actually, did I not put any question slides in here at all? I didn't. Okay, I'm sorry. And I left my doodles from last time. Sorry, millennials. So we have some really interesting information about kind of religious identity in different generational cohorts, because one of the things that happened in the late 90s and early 2000s, as social scientists started to see big shifts in this group of the nuns, people became really interested in studying young people and their religious beliefs. And if you've ever taken a class with me, you're sick of hearing about this study. One of the best studies of this, the most consistent ones, and the ones that I always hold up as one of the best studies you could emulate, is what's called the National Study of Youth and Religion, which basically ran from about 2001 which, roughly the same year that the first millennials entered adulthood, and ran then until the mid 2010s, right? So basically they did, I think, 4 waves of data collection over that. I think I see 3 waves there. It might have been 4 waves, although I've never seen anything published off the 4th wave. But yeah, ran 2001 to 2015, either 3 or 4 waves of interviews and survey data. So they started with about 3,000 surveys and about 300 interviews, and kept going back to the same people basically over the course of about a decade and a half, right? And kind of touching base as to where they were in terms of their religious identities. All right, so probably the number one thing that came out of this was this term. If you if you become an academic and you can coin a term that gets used this much, you know that you'll have made it. Okay, so coming out of the first book, so the first wave of data that they started collecting in 2001, Christian Smith and his then grad student Melinda Lundquist Denton wrote a book called Soul Searching: The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers. And what they found in the book, there's lots of interesting stuff in the book, and I'll kind of focus on 2 things from that particular book. One is what they say young people actually believed and what their religious lives kind of looked like. And they say the basic structure of their belief is something that they call moralistic therapeutic deism, which is different, from orthodox forms of, say, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Mormonism, and all of that stuff. Okay, and orthodox just means like traditional forms of belief. Okay. Hang on, I'll play you a little clip and then I'll talk about it. Okay.
The majority of American teenagers, I think, are moralistic therapeutic deists, not Catholic, not Presbyterian, not Jewish. The God of moralistic therapeutic deism, I say in the book, is something like a combination of a divine butler and cosmic therapist. He takes care of your problems, he helps you to work out your difficulties, and doesn't get too personally involved in the meanwhile. Moralistic therapeutic deism basically believes, sure, a God exists, it's theistic, God created the world, God orders the world morally, people should be nice and fair and friendly, that the purpose of life is to be happy, to be satisfied, that's what it's really about, that God doesn't need to be very involved in one's life, God can sort of be off at a distance, hence the deism, except when one gets into trouble or has problems or needs something solved, then one can call on God and God will sort of hop to it. And teens have an immense amount of faith that God solves their problems. He fixes their troubles and he makes life work better. He makes them happier. Religious traditions are, from my perspective, are really being colonized and corroded from the inside out by moralistic therapeutic deism. And that is, as a sociologist, I am skeptical of what is going to be the fiber, or the theological content, or the intellectual substance of beliefs and practices of people a generation hence. It seems to me that many social forces are basically converging to sort of water down religious faith of all different sorts, so that you no longer have distinctively Catholic and Jewish and Muslim and Wesleyan or whatever. You just have this sort of bland mush of be nice, call on God when you need him. And that is not what these religious traditions really believe. I've come to think that in our culture, increasingly, the language of faith is like a second language. It's like Spanish or French or German. It's not a primary language that people learn and speak. And we know about second languages that you don't just pick it up by osmosis. You need to be around people that speak it. You need to be instructed in it. You need to have practice talking in it. And I think one of the things that was clear in what we found is that very few adolescents are having much practice learning to speak their second language of faith.
Okay, so when Smith talks about moralistic therapeutic deism, basically this is what he means. So this is what he says is the basic creed. So these are the basic beliefs that most teenagers around 2001, 2003 were walking around with. And I mean, interestingly, the co-author on the book, Melinda Lundquist Denton wrote a book last year called Back Pocket God, which is about, you know, the effects of smartphone culture on religion, which I haven't gotten the whole way through because I just haven't had time. But basically, she sort of confirms that, you know, in more recent samples that she's done, she thinks MTD is more or less, you know, thriving as well amongst Gen Z. And we'll see a contrary opinion to that in a little bit, but I think interesting. Okay, so what did young people believe in 2001 in terms of religion? Okay, so the first thing was, you know, most of them thought religion was kind of a good thing. And we're like, oh yeah, there's a God, he exists, and he watches over the world and human life. What was the moral creed of MTD? Well, God wants you to be good, nice, and fair to other people as taught in the Bible. And I'm going to highlight this because it's important. In the Bible and most world religions, right? So there's a sort of syncretizing element to MTD where it's like all religions basically believe the same thing. What's the central goal of life? Well, it's to be happy and feel good about yourself, right? So that's what obviously this deity wants. And this deity is basically, you know, there when you need help, but otherwise isn't particularly involved, right? It's not a deity that requires worship or anything. It's a deity that you call upon, and Smith and Denton will talk about it as sort of a mix between a cosmic butler and a divine genie, right? That basically kind of pops in whenever you need it. You know, like Aladdin, you rub the lamp and you get God showing up to solve your problems. And that good people go to heaven when they die. And good people is constructed in an extremely broad way. You know, when asked, you know, by the researchers, what is a good person? You know, what defines a good person? They basically said, you know, a good person is, you know, anyone who doesn't murder or, you know, isn't Hitler, and basically isn't an asshole all the time. Their words, not mine. Okay. Oops, I want to play that again. Okay, so that said, according to Smith and Denton, MTD is not actually a term that teenagers use, obviously. What this is basically Smith and Denton, from their interview data, kind of summarizing what they think young people believe and putting a sort of label on it, right? And saying that's what most young people believe. Okay, it has three elements, obviously, right? It's right there in the title. It's moralistic, it's therapeutic, and it's deistic, right? So it has these three elements. I will go through them in very short order here. Okay, so it's about inculcating a moralistic approach to life. So this kind of belief system that's widely culturally shared is about having a moralistic approach to life. So what's the point of living? Basically, living a good and happy life. Central to living a good and happy life is being a good moral person. What does that mean? It means being nice, kind, pleasant, respectful, and responsible. And I actually always find this one interesting because these always, to me, there's a weird kind of sync up with American capitalism, working on self-improvement, right? So, you know, I mean, even if you think of it in terms of like what we've talked about with like the baby boomers and how much they leaned into the kind of self-help movement, somehow that's wormed its way into a kind of belief in a religious belief, right? That we should work on self-improvement, taking care of your health, and doing your best to be successful, right? So you should participate well in the capitalist system. All right, and being moral, you know, me in this faith system means being the kind of person other people will like, right? You're not, and especially, you know, you're not socially disruptive or interpersonally obnoxious. So again, not an asshole, right? That's basically what it means to be a good person. And I think, you know, for Smith and Denton, and I think this will carry through, I'll talk about, why can't I remember her name now? Kenda Cressy-Dean talks about this as well. It's inclusive of most religions, which are presumed ultimately to stand for moral values, right? So it's a view of religion that sort of says all religions at the end of the day sort of stand for the same thing, right? They're all about being nice, kind. That's what religion is, you know, and if you could think about it, in these terms, it's a view of religion that says all religions are basically different paths up the same mountain, right? And that mountain is being nice, a good, a kind person. Okay, and that kind of leads into the therapeutic part, right? So feeling good about yourself is also an essential aspect of moral life. Okay, so MTD, again, so here, we did the moralistic, we're now in the therapeutic. What is religion for, and what is God for? Why would anyone, what utility does it have? Well, basically, according to Smith and Denton, MTD is about providing therapeutic benefits, right? Religion is supposed to make you feel good about yourself. The reason I have this name up here, this is Philip Rieff. In the 1960s, he's a psychologist, and he wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And one of the things that Rieff suggested was that in the post kind of Freud era and into the 1960s, that the therapeutic had won the day culturally, right? That basically all culture and any kind of surviving cultural institutions were inevitably going to have to shift towards making people feel good, because that's where the culture had sort of shifted, right? So into, the early years of the boomers, feeling good about yourself, not feeling shame, and all of these things became kind of critical. And so he said religion, if it was going to survive, was ultimately going to have to provide therapeutic benefits. And what Smith and Denton sort of say is this is essentially what's happened, right? Is that religion, so MTD, right? And sorry, this is a quote from the book, and I always forget to put the page number, but this is actually a quote from the book. So MTD, not a religion of repentance from sin, keeping the Sabbath, living as a servant of a sovereign divine, of steadfastly saying your prayers, right? Of basking in God's love, or of faithfully observing high holy days, building character through suffering, basking through God's love and grace, or spending yourself in gratitude and love for the cause of social justice. No, none of this stuff. That's not what MTD is, right? And these are all very traditional things that religions would have stressed. But basically, among teenagers, the dominant religion is about feeling good, happy, and secure, and at peace. And what religion is supposed to do, and what God is supposed to do, is help you achieve subjective well-being, resolving your problems, and helping you get along amicably with other people. I don't like it when it does that. Okay. So this is deism, or, deistic. How is it deistic? So this is the third part of that three-part definition. Okay, so MTD, according to Smith and Denton, posits a particular kind of divinity, a particular kind of God. And it's basically one who exists, created the world, defines the general moral order. So why are things good or bad? Well, because God. But not one which is personally involved in our affairs, especially, and I always love this, affairs which we would prefer not to have God involved, right? So basically God is there to call upon when you need him or her or whatever. But, if you don't want God involved, right, you don't want to, there's lots of examples in the book, right, where people are describing, their lives and kind of nasty moments in their lives, fighting with their father, violating social norms that they don't want God involved in, but God is basically there to sort of make you feel good when you do want him there. Okay, so yeah, and I think key in this kind of what millennials have tended to believe about God is, the God of this faith keeps a safe distance, he watches over things from above, but doesn't really get involved. Okay, God sometimes gets involved, but only when you call upon him, right? Which is when you have some trouble or bad feeling you want resolved. I always think of my friend. So I had a friend in university, right, who I would not have described as a religious person at all. And at one point, he had been seeing this girl, and he thought that he had gotten her pregnant. And you have never seen a person pray more fervently to a deity than this person did, right? Praying on his knees in the chapel, that his girlfriend was not pregnant. And I always think of this as moralistic therapeutic deism. Because, after he found out she wasn't pregnant, I don't know that he darkened the door of a church ever again. But certainly in that moment where he didn't want her to be pregnant, when God was right there, helping out or being asked to help out. Okay, so yeah, basically, you call on God when you have a problem. Otherwise, God is asked to sort of keep their distance. Okay, so this, if you've ever taken kind of 19th century philosophy, and I don't know why you would, deism in the 19th century, like if you took, say, or the 18th century, if you talk to someone like Thomas Jefferson, would have been an idea that there was a God who created the universe and then essentially disappeared, right? That's deism, right? There's a kind of divine order, but God isn't around anymore. Now, what Smith and Denton say is that deism in this definition is a modified deism, in that God kind of is like that, except when you call upon God, and then God will show up. And I think I had my amusing cartoon here, right? The God of moralistic therapeutic deism, right? Kind of coming out of a genie's lamp. Hello there, you rang. How can I make you feel better right now? How can I serve you? Wow, you're looking nice today. You're just the greatest thing ever. Aren't you? Man, I am lucky to be your God. Right? That's the God of moralistic therapeutic deism. Okay. I have so many scribbles. Okay, and I guess the last point with MTD, the God of MTD is not demanding, according to Smith. Actually can't be, since his job is to solve our problems and make you feel good. So none of this like worrying about your sins stuff, because that isn't the kind of thing that makes you feel good. Okay. So, the next thing that Smith and Denton sort of say is that basically, it's not really a religion that people adopt or practice. It's actually sort of a parasitic idea system. So, essentially what's happened with MTD is it's sort of over time wormed its way into other religious and philosophical systems, right? And Smith will say it's corrupted them from within. You heard that in the clip, right? That basically all these religions, right, that used to be very distinct, have been sort of turned into this bland mush of those 5 major points of moralistic therapeutic deism, right? So basically, MTD enters into a religion, kind of uses the core of that religion as a host, like a parasite would, and basically, and he'll say it's not something that could sustain itself because it's pretty thin, but basically it transforms, the substance of those other religions into a version of itself. So it can be, you can have Christian moralistic therapeutic deists, Jewish moralistic therapeutic deists, Mormon moralistic therapeutic deists, Hindu moralistic therapeutic deists, Islamic moralistic therapeutic deists, or even non-religious moralistic therapeutic deists. And basically it's just spent, the better part, and Smith will say, one of the things that's kind of interesting is it doesn't seem to be something that young people came up with themselves. It seems to be something that sort of has been slowly building generation to generation, because most of their parents kind of had similar views. They didn't seem at odds with their parents' beliefs. MTD didn't seem like it was miles away from what their parents believed. It seemed kind of in consonance. Okay, sorry, I didn't clear my doodles on here, but from last term. So MTD, like what is MTD and what is it doing in American culture? All right, so this is from a different book. This is from Kenda Cressy-Dean. Now, Kenda Cressy-Dean, she was part of the project. She did interviews in New Jersey, right? Because they interviewed people in 49 of the 50 states, right? So all of the contiguous states in the US, plus I think they did interviews in Alaska. They missed Hawaii. But basically, she did the ones in New Jersey around Princeton University. And so she got access to the data, and she wrote this book, which is actually, it's a little bit dated now, but it's a really kind of interesting reflection, because she's a youth pastor and a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. And so what did she say about moralistic therapeutic deism? Is she said, all right, why does moralistic therapeutic deism exist? Why has it taken root in American culture? Well, basically, it's a way for Christianity in particular to adapt to an increasingly pluralistic, consumerist, and therapeutically oriented culture, right? Basically, moralistic therapeutic deism, and this is from her phrase, is a way for the church to survive in American society. Sorry, I keep scribbling over my text. By equipping people to be happy enough, right? It's basically a way, it provides that basic kind of moral guidance, a basic kind of framework, be nice, be kind, and all that stuff. And it equips people to be happy enough. It provides enough therapeutic benefit that people can get through life. So it's probably not going anywhere. And the other thing, right, is it's turned God into a sort of tool, right? So when we say academically it's instrumentalized, or approaching God instrumentally, it basically has set up, what the heck do I have in my pocket? Interesting. Unknown business card. Okay. So approaching God instrumentally basically has allowed people to use religion and use God as a way to feel good and make sense of their lives in a pluralistic consumer culture, right? So it's become consumer friendly, right? It's made Christianity into a product that kind of fits the market, and the market is a therapeutic one. Okay, so the other point, I'm doing okay for time. So I love this phrase. Again, this is from the book. I should remember to put the page numbers. But what Ken and Christy Dean says, social survival in this culture requires, and I love this phrase. I wish I could come up with phrases this good. Turning down the heat on Jesus. I don't know why that makes me laugh every time I read it, but it does. Turning down the heat on Jesus and other confessional particularities while highlighting personal communal benefits that make anxious people feel safe and valued. So what does this mean? All right, particularly one of the things that Dean says is living in a pluralistic culture, right? A culture where there's lots of different people from lots of different religious groups or no religion. Basically, one of the problems becomes that as you start to know more people who are outside your religious group, you kind of have to deal with one of two possibilities. Either you have to tolerate each other, or you have to convert each other, right? There really is no middle ground. And what Dean says is that MTD has gone the tolerate each other kind of route by stressing especially the common and minimizing the things that are different, right? The confessional particularities. And she tells the story in the book, and this one always sticks with me, that she was driving her teenage daughter and her teenage daughter's friend to soccer, right? And her teenage daughter obviously is Presbyterian because Dean is a Presbyterian minister, and that's a Protestant denomination that comes out of Scotland primarily. And her daughter's friend is Hindu. And in the back seat, they were sort of comparing their religious beliefs and, came to the conclusion that basically they believe the same things. Now, I don't know what you know about Christianity and Hinduism, but Christianity and Hinduism do not believe the same things, right? There could scarcely be two more different religions in the world in terms of their vision of the cosmos, their vision of moral order, and all sorts of things, right? They do have some commonalities, but there are a lot of major differences. But this is sort of MTD, and this is the example she uses, right? Is it stressed being a good person? Like both religions say you should be a good person. So that's what the religion, what MTD sort of stress, right? Both be good people. We're all good people. That's what both of our religions want. So we basically believe the same thing. And it sort of allows those two young people not to have to worry about converting each other or convincing each other that my religion's right, your religion's wrong. We can all just rest easy in the belief that we all basically believe the same things. And as, there's more young people mixing, people with different religions, people with no religion, and all of these things, MTD and this kind of belief that we all believe the same thing, which is be nice, be kind, and all of that stuff, golden rule, it allows religion to sort of coexist with other religions because you don't have to worry about if my friend who's Hindu doesn't believe in Jesus, that person's going to hell, so I have to convert them right away. If it's I don't want to flash back too much. Good people go to heaven when they die. Well, then as long you're a good person, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, non-religious, well, we're all going to go to heaven because we're all good people. we don't have to worry about being like, but you haven't accepted Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, or that, there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet, right? We could just all be chill and be like, we're all going to the same place. It's all fine. We can just live and let live. Kumbaya. Kumbaya. All right. So that's that. Okay. So that's MTD. I have so much time. All right. You will now experience death by numbers. But I've cut down the numbers considerably because I didn't want to torture you too much. So what does this actually look like? So I guess the question, one of the questions that's kind of interesting, what do these things have anything to do with each other, right? We talk about religion and we talk about life outcomes amongst adolescents. Are adolescents who are more religious and emerging adults who are more religious different in terms of life outcomes than those who aren't? And this is one of the questions that Smith and Denton asked in Soul Searching, and Smith would come back to, and I'll show you a little bit, just very briefly, some of the findings from the second book that came out of the study, which was called Souls in Transition, which was about millennials as they went into those emerging adult years. So start with adolescent years and then move on to emerging adult. So they're asking these questions. Are religious youth different from other youth? Is faith actually consequential in the lives of American teens or not? And this was the conclusion they came to, right? And the emphasis is mine. That although many teenagers can't see it, according to the findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion, the difference between more religious and less religious teens in the United States are actually significant and consistent across every outcome measured, right? So there are consistent differences. And they measured all sorts of things. I won't talk about all of them. Risk behaviors, quality of family and adult relationships, moral reasoning behavior, community participation, media consumption, sexual activity, and emotional well-being. And generally what they found was that the most religious teens were, were doing the best on all of these kind of measures. And they controlled, just, for the statistics nerds, they controlled for seven key demographic factors to make sure that they weren't seeing skews in the data. So gender, right, because they oversampled young women slightly, because women tend to be a little bit more religious. Age, race, region of the country, right, because different regions have different sorts of religious profiles. The South is more religious, the Northeast and Pacific Northwest are less religious in the US. Parental marital status, people with married parents tend to have better life outcomes. Parental education and family income. And we've talked about some of these already, right? You're going to get better outcomes across, all of these. So kids with married parents, with parents who are more educated, and with family income, higher family income, are going to do better. So they controlled for all of these with fancy statistical doodads that you can read about in the book, but I will not spend time describing regression analysis because no one wants to hear about it. Okay, so they classed, basically, they created 4 ideal religious types, which I'll talk about in a sec, and basically, based on these things: beliefs, practices, experiences, affiliation, and group participation. Okay, and so they split the bulk of American teenagers. It doesn't actually equal all of the sample because some young people didn't fit into any of these categories. But between 4 categories, basically the devoted, right? So these are the 8% of Americans who are the most religious. Now, I guess one thing I should say, because I think it's important, is that when they looked at it by tradition, right? So when you split people up by like Catholic, Protestant, Mormon, I'm trying to think what other categories were on there, whatever religious categories you wanted, basically within any of these categories, there's no statistical differences, right, with the general population. So it's not like being Catholic, you had better life outcomes, or Protestant, or evangelical, or whatever. None of those things particularly Black Protestant's the other one, but anyway, being part of, being Catholic made no difference. Being Mormon made no difference. Being kind of generally Protestant made no difference. What mattered was the degree of kind of religiosity, right? So, the most devoted, so basically they split the sample into kind of levels of religious commitment. So the 8% of the most religious Americans, they called the devoted. The regulars, right? So these would have been young people regularly involved in religious life, but somewhat less religious than the devoted, about 27% of American youth. And you can see the descriptors, right? The devoted are there weekly or more, attending weekly or more. They say it's very important to them. They feel very connected to God. They were involved in a religious youth group when they were teenagers. They pray a couple times a week or more and were reading some kind of scripture. The regulars, slightly less, right? 2 to 3 times a month attendance. It's either very or not very important to them in terms of religion and variable religious practices. Okay, then you had 17% of which they called the sporadics, right? Basically those who attend religious services a few times a year or monthly. They say it's somewhat or not very important in their lives. So they feel very or extremely close to God, and other factors were variable, right? So some of them went to youth groups, some of them didn't. Some of them prayed, some of them didn't. Some of them read scriptures, some of them didn't. And then the disengaged, the least religious cohort, never attended or attended a few times a year, but identified as non-religious. They said it wasn't very important to them. Somewhat close to God or less, pray 1 or 2 times per month or less, and read scriptures 1 to 2 times a month or less, right? So you see the differences there. And like I said, only 63% of US teens fit into these categories. 37% were mixed or other. Okay, so what does this actually look like, right? And I've only got a few of these kind of categories, but I thought I'd show you, and then we'll kind of try and explain why. Okay, so, risk behaviors. So things that we generally don't want to see young people doing, right? Is taking all sorts of weird risks, not even weird, but just taking on risky behaviors and this sort of thing. Okay, so drinking alcohol or smoking cigarettes, right? On average, based on their 3,000 person sample, about 7% of teenagers smoked cigarettes at least once a day. For the devoted, it was 1%, and it kind of rises from there. The disengaged, right, were more likely to smoke cigarettes. Drinking alcohol, again, weekly or more, it was 5% overall, none for the devoted, and 11% of the disengaged. Whereas, 88% said they never drank alcohol for the devoted. It was only 49% for the disengaged. Have gotten drunk every few weeks or more, and again, 1% versus 10%. Smoking marijuana, which is very bad for you, don't do it until you turn 25. Then you can smoke all the weed you want, but it actually, I can show you the studies, it rots your brain. Could cost you 10 IQ points. And I don't know if you're like me, you didn't have 10 IQ points to spare. So, smokes marijuana, don't do it, it's terrible. But you had no regulars, 8% of the disengaged. And you just see like the numbers are, low here, high here. Tried it once or twice, low here, high here. Very high here for never, and still pretty high, 63% of the disengaged, but much lower. Cut class, right? So, are you surprised the devoted are goody goods? Never cut class? Versus the disengaged who cut class far more often. Never 6 or more times, or never, 76% never, versus less than half for the others. Gets school grades are C's, D's, and F's, only 3% versus 14, right? So they're not doing as well in school. Suspended or expelled from school, not very high numbers, but statistically significant, 1 versus 9. And, everything in the middle is kind of mixed. And parents report fairly or very rebellious. Okay, so is your teenager very rebellious? Right, 13% of parents overall said that. It's 3% for the devoted, 17% for the disengaged, so much higher, and even above the national average, right? And then parents report teen as somewhat bad temper, 32 versus 49. Okay, body image and self-worth. This one kind of surprises people sometimes, right, what we see is generally better outcomes, right? So if we say very happy, 54% of the devoted, and again, it's above the national average, said they were very happy. 29% of the disengaged. And you can kind of look down the line, right? Do they feel alone or misunderstood? Less so if they're devoted or than the disengaged, right? So 6 versus 13. 52% say they never feel misunderstood versus 32. Invisible, right? Feeling invisible is not good. It's about double for the disengaged compared to the rest of the sample. Feel cared for by people responsible, right? It's 92% for the devoted, only 73% for the disengaged, which is a pretty, it's a 20-ish point, 19-point difference. Okay, so what else is here? They think about the meaning of life often, think about plans for the future. They feel guilty about things in life fairly or very often, less so. You think religious people would feel more guilty, but apparently not. And they feel like, how often do they feel like life is meaningless? A little bit less than the disengaged. So self-worth, body image, all sorts of things, right? They feel more connected to people. They don't feel, they feel cared for by those responsible more often. All right, now this one I think is really key, and I'll flag a couple of things because I think, as I explain a couple of things, this will make a lot of sense. All right, so relationships with adults. So, are they fairly or very comfortable talking with adults other than parents? The U.S. average is 52, and you can see the devoted were much higher than all the other categories, right? So they feel much more comfortable talking with adults other than parents, right? Now, here's the really important one. The number of adults a teen can turn to for support advice, not including parents. National average was 5.7% for all US teens. The devoted, and you'll see how high this number is, right, on average had 8.4 adults that they felt they could turn to. Now the rest of them were around 5, right? The regulars are 5.5, the others are all about 5, okay? So, number of supportive adults, teens, parents know well enough to talk to them about. So, right, average is 4.6. Again, the devoted are much higher compared, and especially, they're basically more than double of the disengaged. So when your parents, when there's something going on with your kid and you want to talk to other adults that your kid, that might know your kid, right, there were way more for the devoted here. All right, and these last two, basically what you see, they spend less unsupervised time than the disengaged, right? So again, these are millennials. This is probably, at the beginning point of the millennials, before a lot of the childcare stuff was really normalized. Okay, I think this is my last box of numbers. Okay, so before I have 4 more slides with number boxes on them. Moral reasoning behavior, right, slightly different. So believes that morals are relative, 45% on average. 22% of the devoted versus 61. And the other ones are kind of trending that way, right? So the most devoted are the least likely to think morals are relative. The disengaged are the most likely to think morals are relative. If you're unsure of what to do, what's right or wrong in a particular situation, you do whatever suits, whatever would help you get ahead. 11% overall, it's 1% for the devoted, and kind of pretty mixed bag for all the other categories, right? But basically a lot of teens would do what they felt would help them get ahead. If you're unsure about what's right or wrong, do whatever makes you feel happy. 6% for the devoted, 40% for the disengaged. And again, that number's just going up as you go along. Oh yeah, have they lied to their parents? Less so. Cheated on tests or assignment? Again, less. And did things they hoped their parents would never find out about? Again, less than the national average by considerable numbers. Okay. Maybe what I'll do, I'll skip this slide. I'll come back to it in a sec because I'll just run through my next few slides and I'll come back to it because I think it'll all make sense. All right. So that was 2001 to 2000 and and 3. So this is about 2005 to around 2007 as they graduate from college and move into emerging adulthood. So basically, Smith and now Patricia Snell, basically split people into the same categories, and you can see the change. As they moved into emerging adulthood, they got less religious. The devoted are now only 5%. The regulars are only 14%. The sporadics are up a little bit, but mostly the disengaged, up to a quarter of the whole sample. So people have gotten less religious as they went forward. Okay, but basically, the differences in these different groups were kind of similar, still somewhat present to some extent as they exited college and entered the middle part of the emerging adult years. And I'll just highlight a couple of quick things. So their parental relationships overall were somewhat better. Like, most people are still in contact with their mother and father, so that's a good thing, right? There's actually not a lot of statistical difference there. But, the devoted tended to feel closer to their mothers than all the other categories, but much more so than the disengaged. They got along better with their mothers, right? A 12-point gap. Talk to their mother about personal subjects. There's a 15-point gap there, and they're the highest, right? So 35% versus 22, 21, 20, and a national average of 26. They feel their mother understands them, 60 versus 36%. Feel close to their father, less so than their moms, right? But still, almost 2/3 versus just over half in the total sample. And when you get to the disengaged, right, much less happy with their dads. Get along extremely well with their father. Again, this is an 8-point spread. It's not huge, but it's still there. They feel their father understands them, 41 versus 26. And they had fewer parental breakups, right? So their parents had split less times. Okay. Social engagement. So they are slightly more involved in the world than the rest. When we talk about the devoted, the average for total number of organizations they're involved with, US average 1.6. The devoteds are high, the disengaged are low, and everybody else is in the middle. Number of organizations, organized activities sponsored by religious organizations. Not surprisingly, the disengaged don't do anything with religious organizations, so that one's not surprising at all. But even when we talk about those not sponsored by religious groups, there's a bit of a spread, but the devoted are still somewhat involved in those. Not, hugely less than any of the other groups. Okay, and members of social networking websites, again, this is the kind of dawn of social networking. So they tended to be less engaged with social networking and visit it less than people in the other groups. So, and that I think will have changed somewhat. All right, and then risk behaviors, right? Again, we're talking low, we're talking high, talking, binge drinking, which is bad for you too. Don't binge drink. Steadily gain weight by drinking just a little bit at a time. No, I'm kidding. But 3 times in the last 2 weeks, or 3% said 3 or more times in the last 2 weeks versus a quarter of the disengaged, right? And the other 2 in the middle. Doing drugs, all over the place, smoking, those behaviors are less prevalent amongst the devoted, right? And likes to take risks, 64% versus 74%, so a 10-point spread. So generally less likely to take part in risk behaviors. All right, and just listen, I think this is my second last number slide. Okay, and I'll go back to the 9 cultural factors because they explain a lot, and I think I'll be okay for time. All right, so, and again, you can just see they rated their health better, their BMI, they were more likely to be in normal. Feelings about their physical appearance, they felt better about themselves, and on, right? They're less likely to feel sad or depressed. Rarely or never feel sad or depressed. Less likely to feel life is meaningless, 4 times less likely. So, 2 times less likely than the categories in the middle. They feel more loved and accepted and never feel misunderstood, like all of these things, right? They're higher for all of these, which we would count as good markers. Okay, and then they are more likely to say they feel life is close to ideal, more likely to say life is excellent, feel satisfied with their personal life. 94 is a really nice number. They've 82% of them feel they've gotten the important things in life. And, average life satisfaction score, average is 14.6. They're above it, and everybody else is either right at it or below. So, okay. I will say, I'll go back to here, because and I should have moved this slide. I always kind of question where I'll put it, because it comes out of soul searching, but I think it's interesting. Anyway, so why are the devoted different? Smith and Denton put this down to what they call the 9 cultural factors. And I'll say here, only a couple of these, I think, are explicitly religious, right? This one for sure, spiritual experiences. I would say maybe coping skills, because of the way they kind of talk about it, and maybe moral order are religious. All the other ones are not, right? All the other ones are basically down to social networking, right? And connection to other human beings. Okay, so I'll explain these kind of very quickly. I'll see what I can do to explain this really quickly, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, so moral order. What is different about the devoted in terms of moral order? So essentially what Smith and Denton say is the most religious part of the sample tend to have, so I don't know if you remember when we talked about this at the beginning of the course. I know that was like 3 weeks ago, and we've covered a lot of ground. When I said that, for millennials, Smith suggested that the bulk of millennials are what he called moral consequentialists, right? That they make moral decisions based on the consequences. Is it going to hurt somebody? Am I going to get caught, right? Is it an advantage for me? So a lot of it comes down to situational things, or what you might call ad hoc reasoning, right? Ad hoc moral reasoning is normal for the bulk of millennial teens and emerging adults. The group that it's not true for is the devoted, right? Because they tend to have a set moral code that's set basically by religion. And it's either, depending on which religion, it's either a virtue-based ethics or it's a duty-based ethics, right? That doesn't super matter, but it's not a consequentialist-based ethics. And specifically, one of the things that Smith and Denton said is that American religions, right, basically the kind of moral codes that and moral values that American culture came to value developed kind of hand in hand with the chief American religion, which was Christianity, right? And so a lot of the things that American society sort of tends to value are things like, self-control and personal virtue, right? Being good, being on time, working hard, being honest, all of which is sort of grounded in roughly kind of Christian values and is often reaffirmed by kind of Christianity in lots of ways. So when it comes down to it, excuse me, sorry, coughing. A lot of the things that, is established by religious virtue-based ethics is ultimately, also valued by American culture. So young people who have this moral order, right, they have clear moral rules. They don't have to think about them, right? They know what's right and wrong because it's established by their particular religious tradition. Those are also things that are valued by American society. So the young people that embody these things are kind of viewed more positively by the general society. So it benefits them in that way. Okay, spiritual experiences, like I said, this is a very religious one. They're likely to have, in religious communities, spiritual experiences that, solidify, I just about had a hiccup, solidify their moral commitments and those constructive life practices, right? So they will go to church and, they'll feel the Holy Spirit moving or something, right? Whatever it happens to be, those, their kind of moral order that they've stepped into is reaffirmed by experiences they have in their communities, right? And that are going to be interpreted by them as spiritual. Okay. So, role models. Now again, you can have role models outside of religious groups, which is why I say it's not specifically religious. But what Smith and Denton say is that in religious communities, young people, especially the devoted, the ones who are there 2-3 times a week, right, are going to see a lot of adults. They're going to maybe be mentored by those adults, and they're going to see those adults' lives positively shaped by those very moral, that very moral order and those spiritual experiences that are part of part 1 and 2, right? So these are role models, people living good lives that they're going to see and therefore connect with and possibly emulate, right? So role models, again, you can have role models outside of religion for sure. You can even have spiritual experiences outside of religion, but, specifically they think that, having these in those religious communities is a big plus for young people. Okay, number 4, community and leadership skills. One of the big things that Smith and Denton found was that on average, young people who were the devoted, right, who were actively part of religious communities tended to have taken on and been given more kind of junior leadership roles earlier in life, right? So those communities would find things for them to do, find ways that they could contribute positively to those communities. And so by the time they're reaching kind of adolescence and emerging adulthood, they've been practicing kind of leadership skills, right? They've taken on leadership roles. They have those things on their CVs. They're confident in taking leadership roles, in being authoritative, in being part of communities. And so they've practiced this a lot more than young people who are disengaged from communities, right? So that I think is super important. They're more engaged in a particular community, bound together by these religious beliefs, and they're given jobs to do in those communities. Okay, coping skills. Religion offers a set of coping skills, right? And I guess I like to say on this point, shit happens. But for Smith and Denton, the difference is that when shit happens, religion tells you what to do, right? Religion has, like when there's a death in the family or whatever, right? You face personal loss or personal tragedy, hardships. Religion has all sorts of built-in systems that sort of click into place where you're facing something and there's an automatic set of coping skills so that a young person doesn't have to come up with how they're going to deal with the situation themselves. They have a community often that comes around them and teaches them how to move forward through difficult things, right? And you can think of in Judaism, when someone dies, the whole community comes around and sits Shiva, right? They come into the home of the person who's died and sit with their relatives for 7 days, feed them, take care of them, and kind of grieve with them and help them move through that process. So you get all sorts of things like that. Okay. Cultural capital, kind of related to this one, right? Related to number 4. Cultural capital is what you get essentially from building skills, right? And some of those skills are communicating with other people and getting those people to want to help you, right? Presenting yourself in such a way as people will want to help you. And basically what Smith and Denton say is that because they're given more chances to interact with people, especially people not of their own age, right? Adults who they might want things from, they get more affinity with navigating the adult world, asking people for things, getting help from people, communicating, and all of that kind of stuff. And remember, right, if we go back a couple of slides here, where is it? They had 8.4 on average adults that they felt comfortable talking to, right? Way, way more than the rest of the sample. Okay, so social capital, again, because they're in these non-age stratified communities, and increasingly, one of the things we know about young people is they live in very age stratified worlds, right? They're in school with people their own age. They go to university with people their own age. Religious organizations are one of the few remaining places where they interact a lot with people of different ages. And so they build they have access to a lot of social capital, right? So basically, social capital is, to put it crudely, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Religion generates a lot of social capital because you have these communities of people who are, together, who at least say they share the same values, and therefore you can use that social capital to help yourself, or, if you're a young person, to get ahead. So, if you need a job, right, you might find someone in your community that owns a company that's looking to hire someone and have access to it, right? over other people. And Robert Putnam. Now this book is kind of old, but it's very famous. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone, right? You've probably, if you haven't heard of it, it was written in 2001, but you should absolutely read it. It's about the shift he thought that television was causing. He hadn't even seen smartphones yet, in people's behavior. But he said that one of the things that made religious people different is that about 55%, and this is in 2001, of all social capital in America was generated in religious communities, right? So more than half of the social capital generated is in religious communities, according to Putnam, which means young people in those communities have more access to it than those outside. Okay, and then this last one is super important, and again, related to this number right here. I'm sorry, my slide is such a mess. Network closure, but this is really, really important. Okay, so network closure. What to say about it? Basically what Smith and Denton say is that because they know more adults, they're connected with more adults, when stuff happens, right, they're more supervised. So they have less time alone, right? They have less time where they're unsupervised, where they can get into trouble, where they can take risks, where they can generally, throw their life off the rails. And because their parents know these people as well, right? Again, there's a larger number of adults that their parents know well enough to talk to. Basically, less of their time is unsupervised, and those adults are all communicating with each other in a more consistent way. So if something goes bad in the life of a young person, right, they get a sad face, it's more likely that that's going to get caught, that the adults in that young person's life are going to be talking to each other, communicating, and are going to be more able to right that ship, right, to get that person the help that they need. And that's really important, right? So that is that 8.4 adults, and I think it's 7.4 adults that parents know well enough to talk to. The network around that kid, they're all communicating with each other more consistently, which means that kid is more likely to get what they need. And then extra community links, right? That's a really simple one, and I won't belabor it because I'm running low on time, and this slide always takes me a long time. But basically, extra community links are, they have outlets into other parts of the world that their community can help tie them into, right? So if they want to build houses for the homeless, there's generally religious groups that do that their community can tie them into, and all of that stuff. And I just killed the slide again. Can I repeat what those 9 cultural factors influence? It's better life outcomes, right? That's why they, according to Smith and Denton, they have better life outcomes, why their numbers are higher on all those little charts. Okay, I already talked about all these, so I'm going to zip forward through them into the last part on religion, which is Gen Z and religion, which I can totally do in 7 minutes. Okay. All right. So as of 2021, what was the kind of religious landscape? All right, so I should say really quickly, this comes from a group called Springtide Research Institute. They're one of my favorites. Springtide. They do research essentially only on youth and religion. And they came out with this study in 2021 where they basically, sort of talked about the religious identity of Gen Z and what it looks like and how it's different. I mean, just in pure numbers, right, you can see Christianity amongst Gen Z here, still a bare majority, right, just above 50% overall. So, I guess when you put the 2% who are Orthodox, right, you're a little bit more than 50%. The bulk of young people do remain religious with, I guess, what's mine? Nothing in particular, atheist, agnostic, being about 24% of the sample, or about a quarter. Okay. I wish you would stop doing that. Okay. So, really important. Gen Z, though, has a very different attitude towards religion and spirituality than past generations. And the really key thing is they are deeply institutionally disconnected, right? They're not connected with institutions the way the boomers, Gen X, or the silents were. Millennials are sort of in the middle. But Gen Z is profoundly deinstitutionalized. Part of this is, actually, I'll skip the faith during COVID part because actually it's not that relevant. But I'll say, generally, it's not the first place they turn to, right? So spaces where they felt safe during pandemic, right? Again, this is in 2021. Religion and spiritual gatherings were kind of low. And when it came to, when they felt overwhelmed or didn't know what to do for help, someone from their faith community was pretty low on the list of people they turned to. Okay. So what did they say about why, when they were facing difficult times, they didn't turn to religious communities? There were lots of reasons, right? They didn't agree with things talked about in religion, 60%. They didn't want to be told answers, and I think this is a really interesting one, right? They wanted to find out things by themselves. Other things help them find meaning. They don't need a religious community. 56% of them said that. They don't feel like they could be themselves. 55%. Religious communities try to fix their problems. 54%. And religion, faith, and religious leaders try to give them answers, but they're looking for something else. Religious communities are rigid, and you can read the rest of them yourself. But basically, there's lots of reasons they didn't turn to religious communities. Okay. They also tended to think that they cared about different things than their religious communities did. This is a slightly weird way of asking this question, but it's kind of interesting. They asked, what do you care about, and how would you say your religious community cares about it? And you can see, right, they think they care more than their religious communities about LGBT rights, gender equality, immigration, immigrant rights, income inequality, disability rights, and everything down the line, mostly, in the 20% range. Here it's over 27%. But even in gun reform, right, it's still double digits. So young people tend to think that religious communities care about different things than they do. Okay, now that said, and this is kind of, it's a little bit less rigorous than the way the National Study of Youth and Religion looked at it. But when they grouped people into the very religious or the devoted and the not religious, what they found was that, and they asked them, are you flourishing in these different spaces? They found generally that those who said they were very religious said they were flourishing a lot more, again, across the board, in double-digit ways. 14% in romantic relationships, 15% in friendships, family relationships, and a couple minutes here, relationships with trusted adults, at work, at home, and quite a bit at home, right? 22%. Across the board, those who were very religious felt they were flourishing more than those who weren't. Okay, so last thing. I can do this in just a couple of minutes. So, the guy who wrote this, his name is Josh Packard, and he talked about it as, almost think of it like Spotify as a religious metaphor. And what he says is the way young people now are approaching religion is quite a bit different. So when I said it's not institutionalized, right, it's because, and here, today's young people say they no longer rely on a single institution to make sense of their identity, engage in community, outline the boundaries of belief, right? So when they're constructing, now, one of the things that Josh Packard said, I don't know, I'm running out of time, is that he disagrees with Christian Smith specifically on the idea of MTD, because he says MTD, right, is really easy. And he thinks young people are working really hard to create their own religious identities, but they're doing so not through kind of adopting closed systems, but in fact, by kind of cobbling together religion from what works for them, right? So they're constructing it, and what Packard said when I talked to him about this, is he said what he was most surprised about, because he expected it to be young people would be like, I pray the rosary or I use tarot cards. But he was like, no, young people are like, I pray the rosary and I use tarot cards, right? They were taking bits of different religious identities and practices that worked for them. And I'll go through this last slide very quickly. I know I'm out of time. I'm really sorry. Okay, so and what he says is they've unbundled, right? So kind of like Spotify lets you unbundle your music choices from a specific radio station, right? So you can consume, or Netflix allows you to unbundle what you watch just, from cable. The religion that Gen Z has is unbundled from broader institutional systems. Okay, so what does it look like? Well, what does it look like to unbundle belief from a single system? He says it's curiosity. They look around for what's interesting and what resonates with them. What does it look like to unbundle identity from a single system? Well, he says it's wholeness, right? Young people don't want to leave any part of themselves behind. And so they're unwilling to sort of be like, well, you know, I'm bisexual and I'm Catholic. They won't be like, I have to give up the bisexual part to be Catholic, right? If it's appealing to them and it's a deep part of what they feel is like their identity, they will not, they want to go wholly into their spiritual systems, bringing every part of themselves, not cutting parts of themselves out to fit a broader system. And what does this look like, you know, in terms of community? They look for those places they can connect, and that's where they go, right? People who care about them or where relationships seem possible. And in terms of practices, right, it's no longer like, I will take Catholicism or Judaism as a set of practices and that's what I do. They take practices that work for them and that make sense. And Packard calls that flexibility. Okay, and I'm sorry to have rushed through that. I don't have time to look over practice questions, but they are on eClass and you can look over them. They're very substantially similar to last time, but if you have any questions, shoot me an email and I'm happy to meet with you at any point. All right, sorry to go right to the wire and beyond.